Between 1809 and 1821, in the remote outskirts of Santa Fe, New Mexico, an abbey operated under a formal charter issued by colonial clergy, then carried over under early territorial governance. Known locally as the Santa Fe Abbey, it was promoted as a sanctuary for troubled youth from isolated pueblos and border villages. Publicly considered a rare alliance between spiritual refuge and structured discipline, it quietly received a total of 12 adolescents over the span of 12 years. None were ever seen again. The Santa Fe Abbey was regarded by civic and religious leaders as a model of organized morality. Endorsed by both clerical and territorial figures, it presented itself as a place of retreat, correction, and guidance for young people reportedly exhibiting antisocial behavior or signs of moral drift. Admission required the signature of a local magistrate and a confirming letter from a village priest. Once admitted, the individual was under the abbey's full jurisdiction. There were no visitations permitted. Public records show minimal oversight, and correspondence regarding internal operations abruptly ceased in 1821. No formal closure was ever announced. The site was left intact, but no living personnel remained. The structure that came to be known as the Santa Fe Abbey was not designed to draw attention. Constructed in 1808 by a labor consortium from the nearby Rio Tesuque Basin, the building had a plain facade, free from ornamentation. Its outer walls were composed of regional adobe, reinforced with crude lime plaster and minimal timber framing. The main complex featured a chapel, 3 dormitory wings, and a service wing for provisions and maintenance. It was located several miles from the main trade routes, requiring a deliberate detour for anyone wishing to reach it. Proximity to a slow-moving arroyo ensured access to irrigation and modest agriculture. Its location was intentional, according to archived territorial correspondence, which described it as appropriate for the moral withdrawal required of the youth in question. The abbey's foundation was attributed to Brother Arturo Mayorga, a former functionary of a Franciscan order, who arrived in New Mexico under the jurisdiction of the ecclesiastical tribunal operating out of Durango. His public record was limited, but included notarized confirmation of his appointment as caretaker of a property designated for youth reception and clerical intervention. The documents made no mention of affiliated brothers, funding sources, or supporting congregations. However, the seal of the Durango Tribunal appeared on all relevant communications, granting the property an air of legitimacy. It was, for all appearances, a sanctioned facility. By 1810, the local governing office, situated in the Santa Fe Presidio, had begun referring eligible youth to the abbey through a process called ecclesiastical placement. Though technically voluntary, these placements often followed village-level complaints about behavioral concerns. Interviews were conducted by a traveling assessor, typically a clerk employed jointly by the Presidio and church office. Written approval was needed from both a civil notary and the priest assigned to the child's home parish. Once admitted, the youth was transported to the abbey by horse-drawn cart, usually unaccompanied. There were no return protocols. No system for correspondence, visitation, or evaluation was recorded. Testimonies from neighboring residents, later archived in municipal registries, described seeing carts approach the abbey once or twice a year. In each case, a single adolescent would be seated in the rear compartment, facing forward, carrying no visible luggage. The carts entered through a side path and were never observed leaving with passengers. Agricultural vendors making scheduled deliveries to the abbey reported minimal interaction. They would be met by a gate attendant who retrieved goods without inviting conversation. The vendors were not permitted beyond the outer gate and were told to leave payment receipts at a nailed plank near the entrance post. In public records from 1811 through 1814, mentions of the abbey remained sparse but consistent. Each year, a brief report would be submitted by Brother Mayorga to the Office of Clerical Inspections, stating that moral instruction continues uninterrupted and that disciplinary needs are being addressed in strict adherence to the Charter. No names of internal personnel were included. No detail was given about educational materials, routines, or outcomes. These reports bore the seal of the Durango Tribunal until 1815. After that year, All subsequent reports featured only Mayorga's personal mark, without ecclesiastical co-signature. Attempts to determine whether this change reflected a formal withdrawal of institutional support have yielded inconclusive results. Surviving documents from the Durango Tribunal's archives indicate an internal restructuring process around that time, during which oversight of outlying facilities may have been delegated or discontinued. No direct reference to the Santa Fe Abbey appears after 1815 in the tribunal's books, nor is there evidence of a replacement supervisor being named. Despite the growing administrative ambiguity, the Abbey's local reputation remained largely favorable throughout the second decade of the century. Parish newsletters occasionally mentioned the youth house in the northern basin, referring to it as a site for correctional retreat. None of the families whose children were placed at the Abbey are listed in surviving census rolls after 1820, a pattern that historians have noted but not conclusively interpreted. Some speculate that migration or clerical error may explain the absence. Others point to gaps in record-keeping during the early territorial years, when shifting governance disrupted regular documentation. A former deputy quartermaster, writing in an unsigned memorandum discovered in the Presidio archives, described a visit to the Abbey grounds in 1816 during a supply verification tour. According to the account, the visit was unscheduled, and the reception was punctual but restricted. Brother Mayorga answered the gate in full clerical garb and declined to allow entry beyond the outer threshold. He accepted the inventory document, but signed it without inspection. When asked whether any additional hands were needed to support operations, Mayorga replied that the internal discipline of the youth forbade intrusion. The deputy noted that the tone of the exchange was formal, not hostile, and that the grounds appeared well maintained. No youth were observed, nor were any other adults present. Of the 12 adolescents placed at the Santa Fe Abbey between 1809 and 1821, their individual identities were not centralized in any accessible format. Surviving placement ledgers held at the Presidio list only initials, presumed birth years, and dates of departure to the Abbey. Personal files, if they existed, were likely stored at the Abbey itself or sent to the Durango Tribunal's archives, where no trace of them has been recovered. Names have been inferred through indirect mentions in unrelated court filings, including land disputes and livestock claims, where family members are named in passing. In 1818, a report submitted by the priest of the Chama outpost referred to the Abbey in cautious terms. While reaffirming support for the concept of moral instruction through seclusion, the priest noted delays in reply or absence thereof to matters of pastoral concern. A follow-up dispatch from the same priest a year later referenced the Abbey only as the distant house, stating that no pastoral correspondence had been acknowledged since the prior year. Despite these remarks, no formal complaint was issued, and no investigation appears to have been initiated. The final entry concerning the Abbey in official correspondence was recorded in March 1821. It was a routine supply invoice addressed to Brother Mayorga, confirming receipt of produce and dry goods from a farm cooperative in Española. The document included a payment ledger and a delivery confirmation, signed by an unknown hand bearing only the initials FG. There are no further communications, reports, or inspections listed after that date. The Presidio's logbooks from April 1821 forward make no mention of the Abbey, its residents, or its overseers. In a separate development that same spring, the land plot surrounding the Abbey was listed as inactive in the territorial land tax register. The designation was administrative rather than punitive, reflecting a lapse in tax collection due to non-participation. A blank space appeared under occupants. The entry was not removed, merely marked dormant. As of 1822, maps produced by the Territorial Cartographic Office still showed the Abbey structure, but omitted the name. The cessation of correspondence from the Santa Fe Abbey in 1821 did not result in immediate inquiry. During that year, administrative focus in New Mexico shifted toward the logistical realignments brought about by the region's transition from Spanish to Mexican governance. Clerical offices in Santa Fe were restructured, with records consolidated or transferred. Several minor facilities, including remote outposts, trading depots, and chapels, were left off official registers pending re-evaluation. The Abbey was likely categorized among these dormant entities, assumed to be temporarily inactive rather than permanently defunct. Cartographic evidence from 1823 onward presents subtle shifts. Though the Abbey structure continued to appear on maps, its annotations changed from youth house to abandoned property. A surveyor's note attached to an 1824 boundary sketch identifies the site as unused but intact. This designation is unusual for the period, as most structures that ceased operation were either dismantled for materials or repurposed. The Abbey remained undisturbed. No auctions, reallocations, or demolitions were recorded. By 1825, attention to the site had faded almost completely from official ledgers. No funding requests, land claims, or clergy assignments referred to the Abbey or its grounds. Despite this silence, its physical presence endured. Delivery records from neighboring ranches included occasional notations of unclaimed border produce, left at a familiar location near the arroyo. Though the documents do not name the Abbey directly, coordinates correspond exactly to its perimeter wall. These deliveries ceased after 1827, with no documented explanation. Oral accounts collected in the mid-19th century describe the property as inaccessible. Livestock herders from the basin region recalled passing near the structure while seeking grazing routes, but noted that fences surrounding the main compound had remained unbroken, and gates firmly fastened. Several accounts mention the presence of signs affixed to the walls, consisting of carved wooden planks with inscriptions stating property held under ecclesiastical reserve. No names or titles were listed. The signage was likely installed prior to the Abbey's closure, possibly as a deterrent to unauthorized entry during its operational years. It was not until 1831 that the Abbey reappeared in official discussion, prompted by a territorial committee reviewing unused clerical land. In an internal memorandum drafted by an assistant clerk, the Abbey was noted as eligible for reassignment, pending verification of vacancy. The memo included a recommendation to dispatch a representative to the site for documentation. However, no follow-up visit is recorded, and the proposal was dropped from the committee's agenda within a month. The continued absence of formal investigation into the Abbey's status raised questions in later historiographical studies. Analysts reviewing early territorial records have noted that procedures typically applied to defunct religious properties were never enacted in this case. Common protocols included inventory audits, land resurveying, and public notice of ownership changes. None were pursued. Instead, the Abbey remained in its pre-existing classification with occasional mentions in property maps, but no evidence of renewed function. In 1837, a request submitted by a civic group in Santa Fe proposed converting former clerical sites into regional schools. Among the sites listed was the Abbey. The proposal, though initially well received, stalled during deliberations over jurisdictional boundaries. A note from the reviewing committee cited insufficient detail on property history and the absence of any transitional documentation from ecclesiastical to civil hands. Without formal release from the original clerical authority, no development could proceed. During a field expedition in 1840, organized by a surveyor contracted by the Territorial Land Office, a partial sketch of the Abbey grounds was created. The drawing showed all 4 exterior walls intact, along with a roofed central wing and partial collapse of an outbuilding. The accompanying log described the area as silent and without encampment signs. The surveyor made no attempt to enter the building, instead recording its dimensions and general condition from the exterior. The visit was categorized under structural notation and filed without any recommendations. From 1841 onward, references to the Abbey largely disappeared from administrative records. Shifts in demographic patterns, including increased settlement along the Rio Grande corridor, further diverted attention from the site. Its isolation, once deemed a virtue in its original purpose, now rendered it irrelevant to territorial expansion plans. Cartographic depictions continued to include the building outline until 1853, when the structure was omitted from official regional charts for the first time. Throughout the mid-1800s, local memory of the abbey persisted primarily through family oral histories. Residents from villages within 30 miles recalled the site in abstract terms, often as a place once used by the priests or where the boys were taken. No claims of ownership were ever made by surrounding communities, and no informal attempts at occupation were recorded. The terrain was considered unsuitable for agriculture, and its proximity to seasonal flooding made it impractical for long-term settlement. An 1858 article published in a regional almanac briefly mentioned the abbey in a section devoted to lost or inactive missions. The article, written without byline, described the location as formerly used for secluded reform, but offered no details. The entry closed with the phrase, "Its history remains incomplete," a reflection of both the scarcity of records and the lack of institutional effort to revisit the site. In 1862, a property index compiled by the Territorial Archive Office listed the abbey's land parcel as legacy plot with inactive use. The classification was administrative, used for locations that had once held government or religious function, but no longer generated revenue or correspondence. No legal holder was identified. The entry noted the presence of structural remnants, but gave no update on condition or occupancy. A privately funded expedition in 1870 attempted to photograph and document the site. The effort, sponsored by a society interested in territorial architecture, reached the abbey grounds after a multi-day journey. Photographs were taken of the outer facade, surviving wall segments and the entrance portal. The team reported difficulty entering due to overgrowth and structural instability. No internal photographs were captured. Notes from the visit described the air as dry, the compound quiet, and no immediate signs of habitation. The report was archived but never formally published. In 1876, a civil clerk preparing a lecture on the history of reformatory institutions in the region requested access to any existing files on the abbey. An internal review was conducted, which produced 3 partial ledgers, several placement receipts, and the original construction charter signed in 1808. These materials confirmed the existence of 12 youth placements, as well as the identity of Brother Mayorga. However, no departure records, outcomes, or follow-up correspondences were located. The clerk's request was marked inconclusive and filed under administrative reference. By 1883, the abbey had acquired an ambiguous status in regional consciousness. It was neither preserved as a historical site nor formally erased. The structure continued to appear on unofficial maps, typically marked only by an outline or the word old. Seasonal travel routes occasionally passed within visual range, but no maintained paths led to the site. Its physical degradation had increased, according to travelers' journals from that period, but no documentation of collapse was submitted to any office. The final institutional reference to the Santa Fe Abbey occurred in 1891, in a marginal note added to a territorial census ledger. The note, penned by an assistant registrar, identified the parcel as unclaimed structure north of Arroyo, presumed abandoned since early century. It included no recommendation for removal or investigation. No further annotations were made in subsequent years. In the years following the administrative disappearance of the Santa Fe Abbey, there were minor but notable irregularities that appeared in separate municipal contexts. These inconsistencies were never connected during the period in which they occurred, and none provoked formal inquiry. However, when viewed in aggregate through archival consolidation in the late 19th century, patterns began to surface. One such anomaly appeared in the form of duplicate baptismal entries. Parish ledgers in the towns of Truchas and Powak recorded a total of 4 individuals whose baptismal certificates bore dates prior to 1809, but whose parental affiliations were inexplicably altered in subsequent census listings. In these altered entries, the original parental names were replaced with either a dash or the word undefined. When cross-referenced with school rosters, militia registries, and tithe logs, no consistent identity trail emerged for these individuals. Notably, all 4 records included notations in the margin, placement confirmed, without further context. Another irregularity was found in the seasonal travel logs maintained by the Chama inspection route. These logs recorded movements of supply carts, mail couriers, and authorize clergy between villages and ecclesiastical sites. Between 1813 and 1820, a series of notations appeared beside cart routes leading northeast of Santa Fe. These entries, logged once annually, described return leg unoccupied. In each case, a cart had transported an individual or shipment to a destination later identified by coordinate markers associated with the Abbey. On return, the cart was empty. The log format included no field for destination description, but the consistent reference to ecclesiastical delivery suggested that these trips were sanctioned. No follow-up notations ever appeared for these same routes in subsequent years. A separate source of ambiguity came from the minutes of council meetings held in the territorial district between 1816 and 1822. In 3 distinct sessions, attendees voiced concern over outbound youth, whose disappearance had not been acknowledged by families or parishes. One delegate, identified in the minutes as Balthazar E., submitted a handwritten list of names, each with a corresponding year of departure, and a destination labeled simply as Basin Site. The list was attached to the minutes, but filed separately. It resurfaced in 1888 during a regional archive inventory. Upon re-examination, the document revealed that all 12 names matched the initials found in the Presidio's placement ledger. Despite the cumulative presence of such details, no investigation was launched during the era in which the Abbey functioned. Several reasons for this inaction have been proposed by contemporary historians. Foremost among them is the jurisdictional fragmentation that characterized early territorial governance. With authority split between military, ecclesiastical, and emerging civil structures, responsibility for oversight was diluted. The Santa Fe Abbey, located in a peripheral zone with ambiguous ownership status, fell into a category that few departments considered under their domain. Additionally, there existed an informal consensus among clergy that facilities operating under clerical charters required minimal external inspection. This assumption, rooted in the premise of religious self-regulation, allowed sites such as the Abbey to operate without third-party evaluation. Archived correspondence between the presiding priest of the Rio Arriba sector and the church council confirms that internal trust superseded procedural audit. A note from 1812 reads, "Fraternal houses once endorsed shall not be disturbed unless breach of sanctity is evident." No reports of such breaches were submitted during the Abbey's operational period. There were also administrative limitations in terms of manpower and reach. The Santa Fe Presidio, responsible for civil coordination across vast terrain, frequently noted shortfalls in personnel. Patrolling officers, supply registrars, and clerical inspectors were deployed only to sites with known traffic or conflict. A property with low visibility and no active petitioners did not meet the threshold for dispatch. Occasional written complaints from village residents did surface, though they often lacked sufficient documentation to warrant response. One such letter, dated 1819 and signed only with the initials LS, expressed concern that a family member sent to the Basin House had not written or returned after 3 years. The letter was addressed to the office of the Ecclesiastical Tribunal, but found its way into the military ledger, where it was marked misdirected, not under jurisdiction. No response was recorded. A second letter, received in 1820 by the regional tithe collector, requested clarification on whether a certain youth named Raphael A. remained in training at the Northern Retreat. The letter was acknowledged, but referred to the local priest who annotated it with the word completed. The interpretation of this response remains unclear. The silence of local parishes may also have played a role in suppressing concern. Clergy assigned to small pueblos often deferred to higher authorities when addressing matters of discipline or moral reform. Once a youth was removed under ecclesiastical placement, no further action was expected of the home parish unless instructed. This deference created a vacuum in which placements became effectively final, with no obligation for follow-up or reintegration. In one recorded exception, the priest of the Tisuk parish did issue an internal memorandum questioning the fate of 2 individuals placed under his jurisdiction. The document, dated February 1821, noted that neither individual had been accounted for in subsequent service rosters or religious records. The memorandum included a request to the Santa Fe Diocese for status verification. However, the record ends with a notation that the request was postponed due to transition of clerical offices. The letter was never readdressed. Another form of indirect evidence appeared in the form of property transactions. Families who had submitted youth to the Abbey were often found transferring land parcels or livestock within a year of placement. Though the motives for these transfers are not recorded, the timing suggests a financial rearrangement that may have accompanied or followed ecclesiastical placement. No documents indicate compensation or reimbursement, but the pattern of transactions is consistent across 6 of the 12 families identified through archival triangulation. Material correspondence between the Abbey and external parties was sparse, but not entirely absent. A single surviving account ledger, discovered in the collection of a retired notary, details transactions between the Abbey and a transport cooperative based in Cuyamungue. The ledger includes entries for carriage services labeled youth delivery and supplies categorized under sustenance allocation. These entries cease abruptly after 1821. No signatures beyond that of Brother Mayorga appear in the book. The cooperative itself was dissolved in 1824, and no testimony from its personnel has been located. Secondary indicators also emerged through educational discrepancies. In villages where youth had been placed at the Abbey, school records showed a sudden decline in enrollment among certain age groups between 1811 and 1820. While broader demographic factors may have contributed, the absence of corresponding migration records or birth shortfalls raised questions. Educational rosters from Nambe and San Ildefonso show gaps in male student participation that align temporally with the Abbey's placement periods. The lack of public discourse surrounding the Abbey during its years of operation was reinforced by cultural norms of the period. Deference to clerical authority, particularly in rural communities, discouraged public questioning of religious procedures. Parents who submitted children to the Abbey did so under social pressure, with the understanding that such placements were definitive and not to be challenged. Oral traditions suggest that discussion of the facility ceased immediately upon placement. Former neighbors of affected families often referred to the youths in the past tense, even in the absence of official notification. The Santa Fe Abbey, by design or default, operated in a zone of procedural ambiguity. Its continued existence without inspection, combined with its functional disappearance from records after 1821, created a gap in institutional memory. Over time, this gap solidified into a category of omission that authorities did not attempt to resolve. Its classification as inactive property allowed it to fade from administrative relevance without formal inquiry. In 1892, during an unrelated survey of historical clerical sites conducted by a private academic society, a volunteer research assistant named Elias Ramon uncovered a cluster of receipts and memoranda stored inside a collection box at the Territorial Archive building. The materials had been incorrectly catalogued under trade route inventories and bore no identifying information on the exterior. Upon review, the papers revealed correspondence addressed to a regional ecclesiastical distributor from an individual who signed as A.M., caretaker of the interior. The tone of the letters was formal and administrative, focused primarily on inventories and scheduling, with occasional references to younger residents and interior discipline. The date range on the correspondence aligned with the known operational years of the Santa Fe Abbey. While no letter contained overt cause for concern, several shared characteristics stood out. They lacked institutional letterhead, bore no return address, and were written in a formal dialect rarely used outside official doctrine. One passage referenced a need to suspend correspondence during days of communal closure. Another noted a delay in supply delivery due to exterior fluctuations. The language was precise but vague, consistent with clerical protocols yet devoid of identifiable logistical detail. The final letter, dated late 1821, simply stated, "Interior preparation is concluded. No further additions to the roster are anticipated. Closure shall be total." Ramon submitted a transcription of the letters to the Society's documentation committee. While the origin of the materials could not be confirmed beyond circumstantial inference, the reference to a roster and closure led the committee to classify the documents as internally consistent with previously uncovered placement logs. Though the authorship could not be verified, the initials and content supported their inclusion in a new case file labeled Unresolved Clerical Dormancy. During a separate initiative aimed at cataloguing unutilized religious properties, surveyor Orin Beltran conducted an on-site visual assessment of several abandoned compounds. His 1893 report included a brief section on the Santa Fe Abbey, referred to in his notes as Old Compound north of Arroyo. He reported that the main gate remained closed and the perimeter wall had partially collapsed along the western edge. The interior was not entered due to structural concerns, but he noted the absence of recent human activity. A single wooden plank bearing the words "Property Withheld" was found nailed to a nearby post. Beltran's notes included a sketch of the courtyard, based on what could be viewed through the front gate. The drawing depicted an open, sun-exposed quadrangle bordered by 3 wings. No movement or figures were indicated. Adjacent structures were listed as unidentifiable. In his final remarks, Beltran wrote, "Property shows no present use. No signage indicates current occupant. Recommend continued classification as sealed." In 1894, the Society commissioned a comparative review of similar properties across the region. Sites once used as youth houses, chapels, or minor reformatory posts were cross-referenced with existing land records and closure documentation. The Santa Fe Abbey remained the only facility in its category without a signed decommissioning letter or recorded transition. For properties of similar scale, such documentation was routine. The absence of such records for the Abbey was marked as administrative gap. A related finding emerged from the census listings of the 1820s. While the names of the 12 original placements were not listed as residents of any known village after their departure to the Abbey, their parental households continued to be taxed at standard rates. No adjustment was made for household size or productive output, despite the presumed absence of labor-age youth. This inconsistency suggests either a misreporting of household composition or a reluctance to revise familial records after ecclesiastical placement. The reason for this anomaly remains speculative, though it aligns with broader patterns of unaddressed administrative discontinuity. Testimonies collected during oral history efforts in the late 19th century included indirect recollections of the Abbey. In a recorded interview with resident Rufina Gallegos, born 1810, she described a distant structure her father once referred to as the retreat where rules were permanent. When asked whether anyone from her village had ever returned from the place, she answered, "Not to my knowledge. Once gone, they were not spoken of." Similar phrases appear in the recollections of other elders interviewed during the same period, each offering ambiguous references to a site described as strict, final, and unreachable. No records suggest that any of the 12 youth placements were formally declared deceased or reclassified. Their absence from subsequent records did not trigger any process of probate, reassignment, or notice of death. In the systems of the time, such outcomes were often implied through indirect means. The lack of any subsequent notation suggests a clerical consensus of silence, whereby missing individuals remained unlisted rather than officially acknowledged. This approach, while not standard, was not without precedent in ecclesiastical cases involving secluded institutions. In the years following the rediscovery of the placement references, historians debated whether the institutional omission was the result of deliberate suppression or administrative fatigue. Given the widespread transition in governance during the Abbey's final years, proponents of the latter explanation suggest that the site may have been abandoned without malice, its occupants simply unrecorded as a result of shifting systems. Others point to the calculated language in the 1821 letter as indicative of premeditated cessation. Regardless of intent, the lack of documentation left a vacuum into which assumptions began to form. Writers and amateur historians in the early 20th century published speculative articles describing the Abbey as a failed reform project, a mismanaged spiritual retreat, or an unauthorized offshoot of a larger clerical order. None of these theories were supported by primary records, and each relied heavily on hearsay or romanticized interpretations. The academic community largely dismissed such writings, emphasizing the need for source-based research. A final discovery in 1898 provided the only concrete evidence of internal habitation practices. During excavation near the foundation wall of the Abbey's southeast quadrant, a group of agricultural engineers encountered a buried ledger wrapped in oil-treated canvas. The contents included inventory tables, rotation schedules, and internal assignments. The ledger, signed throughout by AM, detailed the internal order of activities, including daily chores, reading sessions, and designated silent periods. Each page listed a roster by initial only, accompanied by symbols denoting progress or deviation. While no explicit incidents were noted in the ledger, its tone suggested rigid structure. Assignments were written without commentary. There were no personal notes or signs of informal record-keeping. The final entry read, "Final consolidation complete, remaining units reassigned to interior." The implication of this phrasing remains uncertain, as interior is a term used elsewhere in ecclesiastical documents to signify both physical space and hierarchical designation. No explanatory legend accompanied the ledger. After archival authentication, the ledger was placed in the care of the Territorial Historical Council, which added it to the case file established by the Academic Society. A review committee categorized the discovery as significant but inconclusive. With no corroborating records from outside the site, the contents remained confined to their literal interpretation. Nonetheless, the ledger confirmed that the Abbey functioned in a systematic manner consistent with other clerical retreats of the period, albeit in isolation. The rediscovered materials, though fragmentary, prompted brief renewed interest in the site among preservation advocates. Proposals were made to stabilize the remaining structures and establish an educational exhibit on regional clerical history. However, a lack of funding and competing priorities delayed implementation. By the turn of the century, the site was once again unmarked, its documentation returned to quiet storage. In 1901, a small consortium of university archivists, led by Professor Martín Verdes of the New Mexico Historical Faculty, submitted a petition to the Regional Archive Board requesting full access to unindexed materials relating to ecclesiastical operations between 1800 and 1830. The board granted limited clearance, focusing primarily on inactive holdings categorized as abandoned or unresolved. Among the materials retrieved were travel permits, clergy assignments, and a fragmented series of correspondences bearing seals inconsistent with known diocesan marks. One such document, marked with a rudimentary sunburst symbol, outlined procedural instructions for extended custody of juvenile subjects under clerical direction. The document's phrasing was atypical for its time. It made no reference to moral instruction or salvation, favoring language associated with scheduling, compliance, and role adherence. Terms such as rotation interval, supervisory presence, and containment through routine appeared throughout the passage. The document's authorship was unsigned, attributed only to an office identified as Interior Custodial Annex, a designation not present in any known church organizational structure. Linguistic analysis dated the phrasing to early 19th century administrative Spanish, consistent with forms used in auxiliary mission records. Professor Verdes filed a preliminary report noting the document's alignment with the inventory ledger recovered from the Abbey site in 1898. Both used similar terminology and formatting, with emphasis on anonymity, internal order, and non-rotational placement. Verdes proposed a controlled comparative study using known clerical case models, but budgetary limits prevented full implementation. Nevertheless, he initiated a series of interviews with descendants of the 12 families associated with the original placements. These interviews, conducted between 1902 and 1904, were recorded as typed summaries, later transferred to microfilm and stored at the faculty archive. The interviews yielded limited direct recollections, but included inherited remarks passed through generations. One participant, identified only as the great-nephew of Aniceto R., recalled a family phrase referencing those who were chosen to serve inside. When asked for context, he explained that the phrase was used sparingly and only in private. He had never been told where inside referred to, nor did he possess any written records relating to his great-uncle's placement. Another interviewee, descended from the household of Matteo L., described a set of wooden initials stored in a trunk, believed to correspond to one of the boys sent to the facility. The initials had no accompanying explanation. Verdes' analysis concluded that while the oral traditions did not provide conclusive data, they demonstrated continuity of memory, even in the absence of formal records. He published a limited circulation bulletin titled Residual Institutional Memory in Peripheral Ecclesiastical Contexts, in which the Santa Fe Abbey was referenced not as an anomaly, but as a representative case of unarchived custodial retreat. The bulletin drew attention from archivists across the Southwest, prompting inquiries from researchers studying other secluded clerical facilities. A small network of correspondence formed, sharing data under a joint effort called the Isolation Record Project. Through this network, Verdes received access to shipping manifests previously believed to relate only to agricultural supply transfers. One manifest, dated 1815 and stored in a warehouse index in Taos, included a list of cargo categories for delivery to an unnamed site, marked only by the abbreviation ISF. While it is not confirmed that these initials stood for Interior Santa Fe, the cargo contents included items rarely shipped in bulk to remote locations: blank parchment, colored inks, unbound text volumes, and iron fasteners. Quantities listed did not match those of general mission operations, suggesting an internal system with unique material requirements. Another related discovery came from the storage catalogue of the Rio Tesuque clergy depot. Among unclaimed parcels was a crate labeled Internal Devotional Implements. When opened in 1905, it was found to contain hand-forged candelabra bases, several unadorned wooden seating blocks, and a set of narrow copper medallions inscribed with single letters. None of the items bore markings tying them to a specific mission or parish. However, the architectural style of the furnishings matched structural elements found in the 1870 photographic survey of the Abbey. Concurrent to these archival activities, a separate administrative effort was undertaken by the Territorial Land Office to reclassify inactive religious parcels. In the process, the Santa Fe Abbey property was visited by a structural assessor whose task was to determine viability for reallocation. The assessor, named Ignacio Peña, documented the visit in a signed field report. He noted that the outer walls remained partially intact, though weakened by erosion. The entrance hall was partially buried due to arroyo runoff, and vegetation had overtaken several of the adjoining rooms. No documentation or interior fixtures were recovered. Peña's report included a curious observation. He found a metal cylinder, rusted but intact, secured under a floor beam in what appeared to be the southern dormitory. Inside the container were several tightly rolled slips of treated paper, each containing brief lines of script. The texts were not names or prayers, but codes comprised of alternating letters and numerals, with consistent formatting across all pages. The purpose of the codes was not deciphered at the time. The container and its contents were transferred to the Archive Committee for future analysis, where they were labeled non-standard liturgical entry forms. In 1906, a report drafted by linguist Edgar Malvin proposed that the code entries might correlate to a classification system for residents or tasks. He noted that the alternation between symbol types resembled cataloging used in early scientific indexing, though no direct translation could be produced. Malvin's theory, though speculative, suggested a degree of internal segmentation within the Abbey, possibly for tracking assignments or behavioral compliance. His findings were not published, but were cited in internal memos discussing archival methodology. As material evidence slowly accumulated, public references to the Abbey grew more frequent in academic literature. Periodicals focusing on Southwestern history included brief mentions in articles about unverified custodial properties. Though the tone remained cautious, some writers began to regard the Abbey not as an exception, but as a functioning example of early 19th century experimental ecclesiastical retreat. Without access to complete rosters or testimony from staff, definitive conclusions were limited. Still, each recovered document reinforced the impression of an institution operating on its own terms, with full administrative structure, but minimal external interface. In 1907, a territorial motion was submitted, requesting that former ecclesiastical sites with unresolved closure status be inventoried one final time before statehood. The motion included a clause mandating field reassessment of inactive religious buildings older than 50 years. The Santa Fe Abbey qualified, and an evaluation team was dispatched. The team consisted of 2 architects, a legal clerk, and a surveyor. Their findings, submitted in August of that year, confirmed that while the building was no longer habitable, its perimeter remained stable enough for preservation. No suggestion was made to demolish the structure. Their report also noted the existence of a partially collapsed stairwell beneath the eastern wing. This feature had not been documented in earlier surveys. It led to what appeared to be a cellar or auxiliary chamber, though the entrance was obstructed by debris. Due to safety concerns, no further excavation was attempted. The report included a recommendation that future study be permitted under controlled archaeological parameters. No such study was ever funded, and the stairwell was resealed by erosion over the following decades. The final year of territorial administration brought renewed efforts to clarify the legal status of long-standing properties that had remained unclaimed or contested. Among the sites subjected to re-examination was the parcel historically designated as the Santa Fe Abbey. In December 1911, a formal requisition was issued by the Office of Public Holdings mandating the classification of all ecclesiastical properties whose title had never been lawfully transferred. The objective was procedural, either to verify abandonment or identify remaining claimants. 2 legal archivists were assigned to the review of the Abbey's original charter. They uncovered a notarized deed from 1808, registered under the joint authority of the Ecclesiastical Tribunal in Durango and the Civil Steward of the Northern Basin District. The deed contained a conditional clause stipulating that all property rights would revert to the diocesan fund if the location ceased operational function for a period exceeding 10 years. No reversion was ever filed. The clause, though legally binding, had never been enacted. This discovery led to a provisional ruling that the Abbey remained technically under ecclesiastical domain, despite over 90 years of inactivity. As the diocesan administrative body had since dissolved and no successor office was formally established, the parcel was placed into custodial suspension. This classification prevented private acquisition, but also excluded the site from state-funded development. It became, in effect, a legal fixture without administrative parentage. In tandem with the ruling, the Office of Public Holdings ordered the compilation of a physical inventory, requiring a return to the site under updated survey protocols. In March 1912, the team dispatched included 1 civil engineer, 1 archival examiner, and 2 assistants. They carried surveying equipment, photographic apparatus, and a directive to record any remaining objects or features relevant to prior function. Their arrival at the site coincided with dry seasonal conditions, allowing access to the full perimeter. The main structure, though weathered, remained largely intact on its northern and western walls. The southern wing, previously partially collapsed, had deteriorated further, and entry was not advised. The team entered through the eastern corridor, passing into the interior courtyard. Inside, they documented fragments of wooden framing, sections of worn plasterwork, and a series of narrow alcoves arranged in uniform spacing along the back wall. Each alcove measured less than 4 feet in width and lacked individual furnishing. Among the features noted were 3 stone fixtures embedded in the wall near the chapel area. These were rectangular indentations framed with iron brackets, consistent with storage or shelving purposes. No contents remained. Adjacent to one of the fixtures was a metal hook affixed to the wall at shoulder height. The purpose of the hook was not specified, but its position suggested utilitarian use. On the opposite side of the corridor, the team discovered a recessed panel, behind which lay a narrow compartment containing several rectangular slips of discolored parchment. The writing had faded beyond recognition. Samples were collected for preservation, but yielded no legible content upon review. As the survey progressed, attention returned to the obstructed stairwell previously recorded during the 1907 visit. With updated tools, the team managed to clear sufficient debris to descend into the space below. The chamber beneath was constructed with stone blocks and lacked any decorative elements. It consisted of a single room, approximately 9 feet by 14 feet, with no visible exit other than the stairwell. The floor was compacted earth, and the walls bore faint impressions consistent with repeated contact or movement. No furnishings or structural features were identified, aside from a single narrow recess in the wall, approximately 2 feet deep. In the far corner of the chamber, partially embedded in soil, a wooden box was located. The box was rectangular, fitted with a metal clasp, and showed signs of long-term exposure. Upon opening, the team found a collection of flattened slips marked with sequential numbers and initials. Each slip was encoded in a format resembling the ledgers previously recovered, though these examples were shorter in length and lacked interpretive symbols. They were organized into rows fastened with twine. No names, dates, or locations were present. Analysis conducted after the return from the site suggested that the slips were used for tracking internal movement or assignment cycles. The consistency of format and uniformity of material indicated systematic production. While their precise function remains undetermined, the existence of matching entries in both surface-level and sub-level spaces supports the interpretation of a complex internal structure designed to operate independently of external input. Photographs taken during the 1912 visit remain the most complete visual record of the Abbey's interior. They include views of the main hall, courtyard, alcove arrangements, and the sub-level chamber. In none of the images do any decorative symbols, religious icons, or personal effects appear. This absence is noted in the survey summary as atypical, given the known characteristics of contemporaneous clerical dwellings. The team concluded that the facility was designed for maximal austerity, with emphasis on repetition and minimalism. No biological material, burial site, or organic remains were discovered during the visit. The team conducted soil probes in 3 courtyard locations, each returning uniform results consistent with undisturbed sediment. The absence of such materials reinforced the presumption that the facility's purpose was strictly custodial and not ceremonial. No indicators of long-term residence, such as bedding, cookware, or personal storage, were found in any accessible space. Upon completion of the survey, the team compiled a final report containing measurements, sketches, photographs, and itemized notes. The report recommended that the site be documented as a historical example of non-conforming clerical architecture, unique in its function and execution. It was also recommended that no further excavation occur without clear academic sponsorship. The property was not listed for development or demolition. Following the survey, public interest in the Abbey diminished. Articles referencing the site became rare after 1915, and the property was omitted from most subsequent regional guides. Occasional references appeared in niche journals concerned with forgotten institutions, but no coordinated investigation resumed. The documentation was transferred to archival storage and remained unexamined for decades. By 1920, the site had been partially reclaimed by terrain. Seasonal water flow from the nearby arroyo deposited silt along the foundation, gradually obscuring the stairwell entrance and parts of the southern facade. Vegetation resumed dominance over the perimeter, and paths once used by surveyors became indistinct. Local residents no longer passed near the area, and no new structures were built within a 5-mile radius. The name Santa Fe Abbey remained in limited use within specialist circles, typically invoked in discussions of undocumented clerical sites or anomalous retreat structures. No formal explanation of the facility's operational design, placement protocol, or abrupt closure has been confirmed. Its original charter, though notarized and preserved, offers only generalized purpose. The sum of archival fragments, structural remnants, and coded documentation presents a facility characterized by regulation without transparency, function without publicity, and completion without transition. In the years following the closure of territorial administration and the establishment of state governance, the remaining documentation on peripheral ecclesiastical holdings was transferred to regional university libraries, where they were catalogued under historical collections rather than active property files. Among these was the file labeled Santa Fe Interior Structure, which included the 1912 survey, the 1898 ledger, and transcriptions from the Isolation Record Project. Access to the collection was limited due to its lack of formal classification. Most materials were indexed under institutional architecture rather than religious or legal history, resulting in a near-complete absence of public reference from the mid-20th century onward. In 1936, during a federal preservation initiative under the Historical Sites Registry, a clerical staff member at the New Mexico Office of Cultural Holdings noted the file during a cross-reference of undocumented compounds. A request was submitted to assess whether the site met minimum thresholds for eligibility as a heritage structure. The request was reviewed, but due to the lack of cultural designation or demonstrable influence on regional development, it was determined that the Santa Fe Abbey did not qualify. The file was annotated with a standard remark, non-contributory to public heritage narrative. That assessment placed the site outside the scope of ongoing preservation work, relegating it once more to administrative obscurity. Nonetheless, interest persisted among a small number of academic researchers. One such individual, Dr. Ramon Espada, focused his career on institutions whose internal function had been documented without resulting in long-term occupation or civic integration. In 1954, he presented a paper titled Structures of Quiet Finality, the Hidden Infrastructure of Early Custodial Doctrine. Within the presentation, he referred briefly to a compound north of Santa Fe used for 12 known placements without recorded exit. The reference was not expanded upon in his published abstract. Espada's private notes, now held by a university archive, include an annotated map of the Northern Basin region, with the Abbey structure marked and circled. Several margin notes indicate dimensions, ledger codes, and possible function models based on comparative analysis. A final note reads, "Contains all elements of systematic interiority, functions ceased, not failed." This phrasing, while speculative, suggests Espada viewed the site not as a mismanaged experiment, but as a fully executed protocol that had no expectation of reintegration. No records indicate that Espada ever visited the Abbey personally. His work was based entirely on secondary documentation and transcribed records. Nevertheless, his papers contributed to a brief resurgence in attention to early clerical systems of custodial housing. This attention remained confined to academic circles and did not influence policy or restoration efforts. In 1963, a regional newspaper published a retrospective article on abandoned New Mexico landmarks. The article, written in casual style, included a paragraph on the Abbey, though it referred to it only as the vanished house in the Arroyo Flats. The description was based on public folklore and included no citations. According to the article, locals believed the building had once held students or novices and was left to erode after the final caretaker left. The piece attracted temporary curiosity, but no follow-up visits or rediscovery efforts. During a broader recataloguing of abandoned properties in 1972, aerial imaging of the region showed no visible structure remaining above the surface. The outlines of walls had been overtaken by sediment and plant growth. No discernible rooflines or structural boundaries appeared in the imaging. Ground-based verification was not conducted due to inaccessibility and lack of current roads. The site was removed from the list of active holdings and marked confirmed eroded. As time progressed, the few physical artifacts recovered from the Abbey, ledgers, coded slips, structural sketches, were stored as archival remnants under the general classification of unaffiliated religious operations. Without a living institution to claim responsibility or memory, the materials remained undisturbed. They were occasionally accessed by students conducting research on early New Mexican architecture or clerical administration, but no focused study emerged. In 1987, an index review at a university archive produced a brief mention of the Abbey in a thesis draft titled Territorial Shadows: The Peripheral Discipline Systems of the Early Interior. The student, whose work remained unpublished, theorized that certain clerical structures were designed with the express purpose of producing non-return environments in which outcome was defined not by reformation or rehabilitation, but by cessation of public identity. The thesis referenced the 12 placements by initial and described the facility as operating without return protocols by institutional design rather than omission. The thesis was not submitted to an academic journal, but circulated among a limited group of researchers. A marginal note from one reviewer questioned the classification of such facilities as disciplinary, proposing instead that they were aligned more closely with containment systems modeled after early monastery enclosures. The discussion remained internal. No revisions were published. By the start of the 21st century, the physical site of the Santa Fe Abbey had ceased to appear in any land registry, preservation guide, or cartographic reference. Its location was known only through coordinate triangulation based on early survey reports. The terrain had returned to natural formation, marked by seasonal overgrowth and erosion. No signage, path, or designation remained to indicate that a facility had once operated there. However, in 2003, a digitization project aimed at consolidating unindexed clerical materials included the 1808 charter and the full 1912 survey of the Abbey. The documents were scanned and stored in an open-access format, available to researchers through a state university database. Within the first year of posting, the files received less than 50 total access requests. Among them was a researcher compiling data on closed youth facilities throughout early American territories. That researcher, Amelia Vargas, compiled a spreadsheet listing all known placements into ecclesiastical custody between 1790 and 1840. The Santa Fe Abbey appeared as the only site with more than 10 placements and no recorded release, reassignment, or return. Her summary report categorized the case as non-reversible intake. The term, drawn from internal classification systems used in other enclosed facilities, implied that the purpose of the institution may have been to conclude identity profiles rather than prepare them for reintegration. Vargas's work, funded by a private grant, did not result in further archival discoveries. Her final note, preserved in correspondence to the archive, read, "Nothing unresolved remains in the system. The gaps are structural, not accidental." That conclusion reflected a view increasingly held by specialists, that the case of the Santa Fe Abbey did not represent oversight, but design. The facility, though no longer visible or operational, remained preserved in fragments: notations, ledgers, survey maps, marginalia, and unclaimed codes. Each piece, while lacking context on its own, contributed to the collective imprint of a system that fulfilled its own internal metrics, independent of external recognition or continuity. In 2010, the Department of Historical Site Integration undertook a comprehensive digital reconciliation project intended to cross-index former religious institutions with existing public records on education, welfare, and health infrastructure across the new Mexico territory. The objective was to identify overlapping responsibilities, uncover gaps in service coverage, and establish whether any unarchived functions had been absorbed by secular governance. As part of this audit, the Santa Fe Abbey's file resurfaced under a list of unremediated clerical placements. The dataset confirmed that of the 12 original placements associated with the Abbey, no individuals had been reintegrated into subsequent census data, tax records, marriage registries, or regional labor lists. Each entry in the ledger concluded with a final status of placement, with no amendment, annotation, or closure reference. The file was reviewed by the audit team and passed to an auxiliary office for anomaly categorization. The final classification read, "Closed cycle institution, zero external follow-through." This phrase, "closed cycle," had no standard definition in the record system at the time, but was used internally to denote facilities that operated independently of public oversight or return. In most cases, these were small-scale residences or temporary retreats whose outcomes were absorbed by surrounding infrastructure. The Santa Fe Abbey differed in that its outcomes were neither absorbed nor distributed. No civic, economic, or familial indicators showed any trace of post-placement continuation. Following this classification, the location was flagged within the system as an unresolved historical point of origin. A request was submitted for formal closure through symbolic documentation. allowing the file to be removed from the unresolved list without further review. The request was accepted under the condition that no new information emerged requiring re-evaluation. As of 2011, the file was designated archivally concluded. In parallel to these procedural outcomes, a private academic journal focused on clerical architecture published an article referencing the Abbey. The article, authored by Emilio Caras, was titled "Structural Absence and Doctrinal Silence in Frontier Facilities." In it, Caras argued that certain facilities functioned not as aberrations of standard practice, but as infrastructural nodes without public extension. He described these as environments of total non-reference, in which the individual entered a system designed not to reflect outward. Caras identified the Santa Fe Abbey as a complete example of what he termed administrative quiet. His term described a model in which the execution of procedure was uninterrupted, documented and finalized without need for external notification. The Abbey's intake forms, inventory slips, and coded ledgers demonstrated systematic attention to function, yet produced no outward communication, transition, or disclosure. According to Caras, this indicated a purpose that lay entirely within procedural continuity rather than measurable outcome. Following publication, Caras's model was adapted by other researchers studying parallel institutions. In comparative studies conducted between 2012 and 2015, the Abbey appeared on lists of known closed feedback facilities, alongside similar but unrelated structures in other southwestern territories. These lists were not intended as investigations, but rather as reference inventories for facilities with confirmed intake and no return. In each case, the operative principle was stability through unreferenced function. The Abbey's inclusion in these studies solidified its position within the academic field not as an unexplained anomaly, but as an intentional expression of contained administration. A growing consensus held that the 12 placements were not lost, but completed within a system that required no post-process record. This interpretation required no theory of mismanagement, failure, or neglect. The lack of public interaction was viewed not as an absence of planning, but as a model with different endpoints. While no new physical exploration of the site has occurred since the 1912 survey, remote imaging performed in 2016 using LiDAR technology confirmed foundational remnants, aligned with previously recorded schematics. The chamber beneath the southern wing showed as a shallow depression consistent with structural sink. No artifacts were identified. The location remained undeveloped, unclaimed, and unmarked. Its terrain classification was updated from historical to vegetative basin. In digital repositories, the Abbey's name remains attached to 8 separate files: the original charter, the intake ledger, 2 coded slip sets, the 1912 survey, the Espada notes, the Vargas placement sheet, and the Caras article. None of these items propose conclusive determination. Instead, they outline procedural integrity, continuous categorization, and controlled finality. Each reference to the 12 placements remains limited to initials and intake dates. No surnames were ever introduced, and no individual identification markers were located across other archives. While this has prompted periodic speculation regarding identity erasure or forced anonymity, official findings state that the intake protocol reflected internal procedural norms and not external mandates. The facility's internal framework, once endorsed, was not subject to review. The final administrative mention of the Abbey appeared in a 2019 archival forum convened to discuss unreferenced institutional conclusions in frontier records. The event, held without public notice, included a session titled "Architectures Without Echo: The Role of Silent Design in Early New Mexican Custodial Facilities." The session concluded with no proposal for re-examination, restoration, or further research. The final slide presented a chart of non-return institutions, with the Santa Fe Abbey noted at the top as "full interior system, no variance." Since then, the Abbey's record has not been reopened. No further documents have emerged. The coordinates remain on file, the architecture remains subsurface, and the case remains classified as concluded by internal completion. Public signage, Memorialization and formal recognition have not been pursued. The 12 placements, preserved only through initials and encoded sequence, remain within the closed archive. Their identities have not been formally attributed. Their families, known only through census fragments and inferred connections, left no petition. No outreach, amendment, or correction has been requested by any known descendant. Their entry into the Abbey system was documented, authorized, and stored. Their subsequent presence was internally categorized. Their closure, final and uninterrupted, was procedural. Their names did not reappear. The system in which they were placed has not been repeated. If this story impacted you, if you stayed until the end, it's because you feel these hidden truths also need to be exposed. So leave in the comments the city you're watching from. This way we can see how far these stories are reaching. And subscribe to the channel. There are many other cases the world tried to forget, but we insist on remembering. This story was taken from documents that were found. All names have been edited to protect the source.